Today we'll study the dependency theory of development, which tries to reason out or figure out the cause of underdevelopment in developing countries. After studying this module, you will know what is the meaning of dependency and also understand the different views on dependency. Dependency is a structuralist theory of development which was developed in late 1950s by Rolf Prebisch, who was then the director of United Nations for Economic Commission, and his colleagues. They tried to find out why the economic growth, as was suggested by neoclassical theory, which assumed that it was beneficial to all even if the benefits were not always equally shared, is not helpful for the economic growth in the underdeveloped or poorer countries. This ambiguity led to the dependency theory, and the dependency theorists, they tried to reason out this particular ambiguity. The dependency theorists belong to different schools of thought, and these schools can be classified under Marxists, neo-Marxists and structuralists. The prominent theorists among them are Andre Frank, O. Sunkel, C. Furtado, Dos Santos, E. Emmanuel and Samir Amin. All these economists or theorists have serious points of disagreement amongst them as to what dependency is. And so we can say that there is no one single unified theory of dependency. However, dependency can be defined as an explanation of the economic development of a state in terms of external influences on national development policies. These influences can be political, as was in our case when imperialist powers took us as a colony, can be in the form of economic influence, as nowadays is in the case of new international economic order, and these influences can be cultural also. There are certain core propositions which seem to underlie the analysis of most dependency theorists. The central contention of dependency theory is that poor states are impoverished and rich ones are enriched by the way poorer states are integrated into the world system. That is, during the time of imperialism, how the third world countries of Asian and African continent were ingrained in the total world system by European powers. And so dependency can be termed a historical condition that shapes a certain structure of the world economy in which it favors some countries to the detriment of others. The favored countries are the first world countries, and the countries who were detrimented were the third world countries. This dependency limits the development possibilities of subordinate economies, which are the third world countries, and is a situation in which the economy of a certain group of countries is conditioned by the development and expansion of another economy. Thus, the dependence of less developed countries on developed countries is the main cause of underdevelopment of the third world or developing countries. There are three common features which most dependency theorists share. First is that the total international system is comprised of two sets of states. These states can be described as either dominant or dependent, center or periphery, or metropolitan or satellite. And among them, the dominant, center or metropolitan states are generally the first world countries, and dependent, periphery or satellite countries are the third world countries. In these third world or dependent states, the external forces are of singular importance to all the economic activities taking place. These external forces include multinational corporations, international commodity markets, foreign assistance, communications, or any other means by which the advanced industrialized countries can represent their economic interests abroad in third world or developing countries. The relationship between dominant and dependent states are dynamic. Why dynamic? Because the interactions between the two sets of states, that is periphery and center, tend to not only reinforce but also intensify the unequal patterns. It is a deep-seated historical process which is rooted in the internationalization of capitalism. The central propositions of dependency theory are, first, that underdevelopment is fundamentally different from undevelopment. Whereas underdevelopment refers to a situation in which resources are being actively used, they are not used in a way in which the poor states are benefited. It benefits the dominant states, and undevelopment is a simple term which refers to a condition in which resources are not being used. These dependent countries are facing the problem of underdevelopment than undevelopment. The poorer countries of the world are not behind or catching to the richer countries of the world as is often been suggested. They are poor because they were coercively integrated into the European economic system during the time of imperialism only as producers of raw materials or to serve as repositories of cheap labor, and were denied the opportunity to market their resources in any way that competed the dominant state. Alternate uses of resources was preferable, and the resource usage pattern was imposed on the dominant states, such as the dependent states were asked or were forced to export agriculture only, which did not have a place, a standing in global market, and put them at a lower pedestal than the dominant states, which used to export industrialized products or the raw materials taken from the developing countries and converting them into manufactured goods and then exporting them to the developing countries. The diversion of these resources over time is maintained not only by the power of the dominant states but also through the power of elites in the dependent states. These elites, who have generally studied outside or are a part elites of dominant states, they maintain a dependent relationship because their own private interests coincide with the interests of the dominant states. Thus, this dependency relationship is a voluntary relationship wherein the elites in a dependent states are consciously betraying the interests of their poor, sincerely believing that the key to economic development lies in following the prescriptions of liberal economic doctrine which is being propounded by the developed states or dominant states. Now, coming to the explanation of dependency theory, underdevelopment of dependent states is not backwardness but intentional downward development imposed on them by the dominant states. The economic factors are the dominant cause of dependence. There are certain theories, certain aspects of which there are certain external trade theories which concentrate on economic relations between countries. Imperialism theories are there which stress on politico-economic interests that make exploitation possible, as was the case in India. Then there are dependency theories who elaborate these imperialism theories and they concentrate on the deformation of internal structures by external dependence which perpetuates the external dependency. The deformation that has just been mentioned of the economic and social system leads to structural heterogeneity in dependent states, wherein there are rich elites and marginal masses. There is a destruction of traditional economy of dependent states oriented towards fulfilling the internal needs. The center-periphery relationship reproduces itself within developing countries between metropolis and rural hinterland. The colonies of imperial powers have been exploited through the destruction of indigenous lifestyle and culture, economic extraction, and forced integration into the international division of labor. This asymmetric integration of the indigenous traditional society with the imported industrialized society caused structural changes in the peripheral societies, which are generally the third world societies, economy oriented towards the requirements of the industrial countries, and a functional dependency of the traditional sector on this export oriented sector. There are certain other views regarding dependency which suggest that foreign capital reimposes dependency because the foreign capital leads to external orientation. The dependent states are supposed to export primary commodities and import manufactured commodities, and thus they come up with heavy fiscal deficits and balance of payment disequilibrium. To recover these disequilibriums, the international agencies, there are other features to dependency other than this historical background. One is that dependency is reinforced by foreign capital. That means that since dependent countries are supposed to export primary commodities and import manufactured commodities, which leads to a heavy fiscal deficit and a balance of payment which is adverse to the dependent countries. To recover or to come up to fulfill this gap of fiscal deficit and balance of payments, the dependent countries are supposed to take foreign aid from the international institutions which reimposes dependency. Secondly, the foreign investment in the form of FDI and FIIs and aids reinforce dependence. Then there is technological dependence. Trade and unequal exchange is there, in which the primary commodities are exported, as has been just now said, which have inelastic demand with respect to price and income. This leads to severe balance of payment deficits in dependent countries. Dualism at international level leads to dominance of center and dependence of periphery. The president of Brazil, Fernando, summarized dependency as a financial and technological penetration by the developed capitalism, centers of countries of periphery and semi-periphery. This produces an unbalanced economic structure within the peripheral societies and leads to limitations on self-sustained growth in the periphery and between them and centers. This favors the appearance of specific patterns of class relations. These require modifications in the role of state to guarantee both the functioning of the economy and the political articulation of a society, which contains within itself inarticulateness and structural imbalance. The dependency theory is also criticized by free market capitalist economists such as Peter Bauer and Martin Wolf. They suggested that if dependency was not there, the state-owned companies, they have higher rates of corruption than privately owned companies. By subsidizing the in-country industries and preventing outside imports, these state-owned companies may have less incentive to improve their products, become more inefficient in their processes, to please customers or to research new innovations. The industries reliant on government support may not be sustainable. And lastly, subsidies on domestic industries come out of state coffers and therefore represent money not spent in other ways. Example given against dependency theories are Indian economy, which after moving from straight control business to open trade has flourished. There are South Korean and North Korea as trade-based development versus autarkic self-sufficiency. African states in which Zimbabwe emphasized import substitution development and is typically among the worst performers in African continent. While the continent's most successful non-oil based economies such as Egypt, South Africa and Tunisia have pursued trade-based development and have flourished. Free market theorists also see dependency theories' complaints as legitimate, but their policy prescriptions as terrible, because those policies only aggravate the disparity between the developed nations and the underdeveloped countries. Let us now summarize what we have learned in this module. Domination of the rich over poor has led to continued dependence of the latter, and the disparities are still going on. The global economy provides benefits to the rich at the cost of poor. Political and economic relationships between the nations limit the development of periphery. Dependency theories believes that persistence of colonial dependency is now there also. Economic structure of the poorer countries is dependent on wealthier countries. Club this with other views. As told you in the beginning, the term dependency was coined by Prebisch. Prebisch, in his initial explanation for the phenomena, was very straightforward. That poor countries exported primary commodities to the rich countries, who then manufactured products out of those commodities and sold them back to the poorer countries. The value added by manufacturing is a usable product always cost more than the primary products used to create those products. Therefore, poor countries could never be earning enough from their export earnings to pay for their imports. Prebisch's solution was similarly straightforward. Poorer countries should embark on programs of import substitution so that they need not purchase the manufactured products from the richer countries. The poorer countries would still sell their primary products on the world market, but their foreign exchange reserves would not be used to purchase their manufactures from abroad. Three issues made this policy difficult to follow. The first is that the internal markets of the poorer countries were not large enough to support the economies of scale used by the richer countries to keep their prices low. The second issue concerned the political will of the poorer countries as to whether a transformation from being primary product producers was possible or desirable. The third and final issue revolved around the extent to which the poorer countries actually had control of their primary products, particularly in the area of selling those products abroad. These obstacles to the import substitution policy led others to think a little more creatively and historically at the relationship between rich and poor countries. At this point, dependency theory was viewed as a possible way of explaining the persistent poverty of the poorer countries. The traditional neoclassical approach, as was said earlier, was virtually nothing on this question except to assert that the poor countries were late in coming to solid economic practices, and that as soon as they learned the techniques of modern economics, then the poverty would begin to subside. However, Marxist theorists viewed the persistent poverty as a consequence of capital exploitation. A new body of thought called the word systems approach argued that the poverty was a direct consequence of the evolution of the international political economy into a fairly rigid division of labor which favored the rich and penalized the poor.